I introduced myself to some of you this morning already, but not all of you were here. So my name is Colin Davis. I am an admissions tutor in the School of Experimental Psychology here. It's always a tough act to follow Ruth. And also I should say that I don't normally give this talk. It's only given by my colleague Roland Badley. I discovered when I arrived today that Roland's been called away, so he's not giving the talk today. And then I also discovered we're going to be filming this one, which was nice to find out. But I do have Roland's slides, so my plan is to go through and deliver essentially the same kind of talk that Roland would normally do. He's also an admissions tutor. I'll do it slightly differently because I'm not him. But I'll try to follow the essence of that approach, because I know from having heard feedback from people who've listened to Roland's talk before that they appreciate the fact that he's very frank about his choices, and people often say, I wish I'd had all of this information at the start of this process. Now, I know that many of you by this time probably have already visited quite a few universities, so hopefully you're starting to get your head around how academia works and the differences between the different courses. But hopefully you still might find out a little bit from this talk that might be useful for you. And I really want to emphasize that, in part, of course, my role as an admissions tutor is recruitment, to try and persuade you that Bristol is a good place to come. But actually, I see for myself my role as being more about just trying to give you useful information, because from a purely self-interested point of view, one of the things that we really value about our interaction with students is the fact that we're very fortunate at Bristol to have not just really clever students, but students who are really enthusiastic, highly motivated, and are here because they know that this is the right place for them. So I just want to make sure that you get a feel for what Bristol is like, how it might differ from other places, so that if you do put down Bristol as your choice, you know what you're getting yourself into. Okay, all right, so as you said, my name is not Roland Badley, so ignore that. I changed the title slide, but not all of his slides. Well, I'll use this opportunity to briefly mention, so I'm a professor of cognitive psychology. Most of my research is about language, how we understand and produce language. I'm particularly interested in reading and dyslexia. I also do some research on political psychology and elections, so this is quite a topical subject at the moment. So some of you might have seen a letter that I had published in The Guardian yesterday about these election debates, or heard me speaking on radio. I'm happy to talk to you later on if you have any questions about some of my research there. But really, what I want to focus on, of course, in this talk is about a question that's pressing for you. So, you presumably all have offers to study at Bristol and at various other institutions, and you're thinking, where should I go? You have to think about things like, well, I want to go somewhere where they have really good teaching. Hopefully you'd like to be at somewhere where you really be inspired by your subject and have great teachers. Another thing you might want to think about, of course, is where you're going to live. These are important years of your life, and it's nice when you're looking back on those years to think that you were living somewhere that you really enjoyed. And, of course, one of the things that you'll want to think about is what's going to happen when I graduate? What are my job opportunities going to be? So those are all things that you'll want to take into consideration. Sounds simple, but of course it's not. This is a difficult decision. Now, I guess one thing that I want to say at the outset, just to put your minds at ease a little bit, is that there is a sense in which it's all going to be okay. You have offers from not just from Bristol, but from other places. There are a lot of good psychology departments in the country. You couldn't go far wrong if you just chose randomly, probably. So it's going to be okay. But let me say a little bit about some of the factors you might want to take into consideration and why Bristol might be the right place for you. Okay, so yes, it is simple in some ways. So it's almost certainly the case that all of the places that you're considering are psychology departments that are BPS accredited. Now, if you're not sure what that means, then it's important that you do know about this. So there is this organisation called the British Psychological Society, BPS. That's important for you if ultimately you want to practice as a psychologist, whether it's as a clinical psychologist or occupational health, forensic, whatever kind of psychologist you might be interested in being, you'll have to be registered with the BPS in order to be able to call yourself a psychologist. And to be registered, you need to have a psychology degree that is BPS accredited. Now, there are lots of departments of psychology around the UK that have BPS accreditation. We're one of them, but there are plenty more, and probably all of the ones that you're considering have BPS accreditation. If there are any that don't, maybe you might consider crossing those ones off the list, but probably they all do. And the upshot of that is that there is an awful lot of similarity across what's taught across different psychology departments across the country. And that's something that no doubt you'll have noticed if you've visited a number of different universities now. And the reason for that is that in order for a course to be BPS accredited, we have to teach according to a syllabus that's laid down by the BPS. So they have determined a set of things that they think that everyone who practices as a psychologist should know, some core knowledge that you should have learnt. And it's particularly in second year that a lot of that core knowledge gets taught. So if you look at second year across different psychology departments across the country, you'll see an awful lot of overlap. You know, they're all teaching cognitive psychology, social psychology, developmental, biological. Having said that, there are important differences in flavour and the way in which these are taught, which I'll come on to in a moment. But there will be a lot of similarity across department. Lots of good psychology departments around the country. So, I mean, this is a bit extreme. I'm not encouraging people to choose randomly, but I know that it's something that people can find quite stressful, and so, you know, I think it will be okay as a good message to give you. Now, Roland likes to set this problem up for you in this way, what he calls the Amley test. His daughter is called Amley, and so you can think about, well, here she is. So where would he recommend she goes? Well, I have a daughter myself called Hope, and like Roland's daughter, she's very bright. Maybe she might be interested in studying psychology one day. And so I can think about, well, where would I recommend to her that she should go? Or at least what kinds of factors should she take into consideration? Okay, well, one of the things that you want to consider is how do different psychology departments differ? You can look at the nature of the department, where it's located, the city that it's in, and then you can look at the university as well. And those are all important things to take into consideration. So let's start with the department. Within that category, there's various different dimensions on which they differ. The type of research and the extent to which research is important, the size of the department. Surprisingly, the age profile of the department is something that might be relevant. And then the department's place within the university. Okay, so let me start with research. Why would that matter? Well, it is a fact of life that academics are really interested in research. I mean, that tends to be what has got us into this job. You know, we love to teach, but we love to do research as well. So that's something we're really interested in. Bristol is a research-intensive university, and our department is very strong on research. Now, you might think, well, as a student, why should I care about that? Perfectly reasonable question. Well, it does make a difference, and here's why. In your first year, it probably doesn't matter too much. There will be some correlation between researching ability and teaching ability, but it's by no means a perfect correlation. So there'll be plenty of places where you can get very good first year teaching, irrespective of whether or not they're great researchers. But in second year, this really does start to make a difference. So if you go to a department where there is more of a concentration on research, then the way in which that will be reflected in teaching is that rather than being taught from the textbook, you'll be taught about developmental psychology, for instance, from someone who is a leading researcher in developmental psychology, and they'll be telling you about the cutting-edge contemporary research that they and others in their field are doing. So you won't be experiencing this as something that's dry and not living from a dusty textbook. You'll be finding out about this from the horse's mouth, as it were, and really experience psychology as a living, breathing discipline. And we think that's really important. So that's one of the aspects of our course that I think we're particularly proud of. And that becomes even more important in your third year for a couple of reasons. So one is that in all of the different psychology departments, although you don't really get any choice in second year because we are teaching to this BPS syllabus, in third year you do tend to get choice, different specialist options from which you can choose. And if you're going to a more research-intensive university, then you'll have an opportunity to enroll in these small seminar courses where you go very deeply into a subject and you're taught it by someone who is a leading expert in that field. And that's an enormously valuable experience. And the other reason that this is important in your final year is that in all of these psychology departments, what you have to do in your final year is engage in a major research project, this final year research project, which is a particularly big component of our course, so it's worth a big chunk of third year. And we see all of our 3 years as leading up to that. So what we're doing in first and second years is giving people the skills they need to be able to tackle a really major piece of work. Because what you have to do in that final year research project is identify a particular research question, find out all about that research area, think about how you are going to try to answer that question. What kind of experiment could you run to find out the answer to this question? So you're putting into practice all of this research methodology that we've taught you over the first few years. And then you collect data, you have to analyze that data using the statistical methods that we've taught you, and you have to write it up. And when I tell people about this, often they say, well, this sounds kind of scary. I'm not sure if I can be able to do that. And that's a reasonable reaction because it is a difficult thing to do, but our students do a terrific job of doing that. And you can see that if you go down to our Psychology Hub, where many of you have already been today, then you can see plenty of examples of final year research projects that have been written up and published in international peer-reviewed journals. That gives you some indication of the quality of the research that our students are doing in their final year. So they're doing a really good job because they've had this training. Now, you might also be thinking, well, that's nice, but what I want to do is become a clinical psychologist or become a management consultant or whatever. And I don't see why I should be that concerned about this research project. Well, the reason is that the skills that you get in the course of doing this project are exactly the sort of transferable skills that employers are really looking for. You are demonstrating that you can do a survey of the literature and take in lots of information and synthesize that and generate research questions, that you can work with data, with numbers, with computers, and perhaps most importantly, that you're able to convey that, to communicate that clearly and straightforwardly. So even if you never end up thinking about the particular topic of research that you undertook in your project again, once you leave university, the skills that you've developed are things that will serve you well for the rest of your career. Okay, so that's something you undertake under the supervision of a single member of staff, and it's really important to have someone who's an expert guiding you through that, and someone who's really motivated, who themselves is, someone who loves research and wants to work with you on this project. And this is an aspect of our teaching that we all really enjoy, the opportunity to work closely with individual students and do science together. Okay, so I think I've talked lots about projects. Well, okay, so I guess another reason why being at a more research-intensive department is valuable in that sense is because there is increasing pressure on universities. Many departments across the sector are taking in a larger number of students. This is an aspect of teaching that takes a lot of time. And so there's strong pressure to rationalize it and make that final year research project a less involved aspect of teaching. Maybe something where you work in big groups and you're just told what your question is and told go and do this. But in a research-intensive department like ours, there will always be very strong resistance to that kind of rationalization because we value research so much and we think these research projects are so important. That's something that my colleagues are really not going to allow to happen. Okay, so let me move away from research and talk about another variable, the size of the department. That's an easy thing to measure, and it's something that it's worth considering. Psychology is in a fortunate position in many ways. It's a popular subject. Lots of people want to study psychology. From the perspective of a university, a nice thing about psychology is it's not one of the more expensive subjects to fund. We don't need lots of really expensive equipment and resources, not compared to medicine, chemistry, biology, and so on. And so universities, they like psychology and they see, unfortunately, sometimes psychology is a cash cow, and they say, let's just take more and more psychology students. And that has led, particularly in recent years, since fees have gone up, for many departments to say, okay, we're going to grow. And you look at different psychology departments and you see that they're taking 20%, 30%, sometimes 100% more students than they were a few years ago. So you do get some departments around the country that are very large, and that has pros and cons, which is somewhat subjective, and what's right for you will depend upon your perspective. So a good thing about being in a big department is that when you get to third year and you're having to choose from amongst these different options, big departments will have lots of staff, so there'll be lots of different options to choose from. And so there'll be more possibility of you being able to find a very specialist course that corresponds to exactly the kind of thing that you're interested in. So that's clearly a good thing. On the other side of the equation, though, when you're in a very big department, it's easy just to get lost in the crowd. I think back on my experience as a student. You might be able to tell from my accent, or if you're wondering, I did all of my study in Australia. I studied in Sydney. When I was an undergraduate, there were more than 700 students in my first year lectures. And I guess at the time, I thought it was quite nice that I could just blend into the crowd, be very anonymous. But one of the things that really struck me when I returned to the UK and started working in universities was how nice it is to be in a smaller department where actually you get to know everyone. And that's a nice thing about a department the size of Bristol. We're a medium-sized department, so we're not really small. You don't really get small departments anymore, but there are a number of medium-sized departments. We're one of those. And it means that the students on the course, they know each other. And they know us, they refer to staff by our first names. That's nice. I don't know all of our students, but I get to know quite a lot of them. I get to know them by name. And that's just a nice thing. It feels like you're part of a community. So, as I say, pros and cons to do with size. That's definitely a variable that you might want to take into consideration. Okay. This is a particular theory that Roland has about the importance of the age of staff in the university. It wasn't something I'd ever really thought about myself previously, and I'm not sure how much weight I would put on this, but let me explain Roland's theory. It's interesting. So he says that there are three ages of scientists broadly. When you're younger, you're just out of your PhD or your first postdoc, you're enthusiastic, you're fresh, perhaps not quite as knowledgeable as later on. In the middle age of the scientist, now they know a lot, they've done a lot of teaching, a lot of research, they can do those things well. This is a period when they're perhaps at their most productive. And then you have the more senior ages where by this stage you become very well established, you might be famous in your own field, but perhaps not quite as active as you once were. So we are, for the most part, at Bristol in this middle age category. I mean, you look around at the people who are in our department, a large number of them are about my age, mid-40s. According to Roland's theory, that's the sweet spot. That's something you should look for. Again, I think you can take that with a grain of salt if you like, but it certainly is the case that if you go somewhere where you have a predominance of very young members of faculty, and that sometimes happens. Sometimes in a particular department, you get lots of people retiring all at the same time, and then lots of fresh blood. So it's a very youthful department. That has its advantages and disadvantages, and correspondingly, if you have a department where the median age is 60 or older, then that's going to affect the nature of the teaching and the experience as well. So that's something you might consider. Place in the university. This is something that might be a bit harder for you to judge, but probably does have a bit of an impact on the nature of your experience. So there are some universities where psychology is clearly the jewel in the crown. It is the best science department in the Faculty of Science. Cardiff might be one where this is more or less true. And the good thing about that is that when you have a department like that, they can draw on the resources of the university. They never have trouble getting funding for more equipment, for better teaching spaces and so on. So that's a nice position to be in. And then there are plenty of other psychology departments around the country, which are good departments, but they, the chemistry department has, 3 Nobel Prize winners, and the biology department is the best one in the country. And so even though psychology is good in those places, it's a bit of a bit player. So it can't draw on resources in quite the same way. We're sort of in the middle. in that category. So, we have a really good psychology department, but Bristol has lots of really good science departments. So, we do okay, do better. All right, another thing that many of you will have looked at, which, certainly it doesn't hurt to have a look at, are these league tables. You can see what Roland's position on this if I show you. This tables equals comedy, says Roland. I think it's true. You should take these tables with a grain of salt. They're interesting to look at. If you are going to have a look at them, then don't just look at one. Have a look at a number of tables from different newspapers across different years. One thing that you'll notice if you do that is that, from one year to the next, a given department will jump 10 places, fall 10 places. And what that reflects is that actually there are a bunch of departments that are very close to each other on all of these metrics, and then very tiny things that would be imperceptible to you can cause them to drop several places, maybe 20 places in the rankings. The other thing, of course, is that whenever you have these kinds of tables, then some institutions will really indulge in game playing to push their brand up the table. That's something that Bristol has tended not to do. I guess Bristol has been guilty of being a little bit snobby about tables. We think we're not going to just what we do on the basis of these. Other institutions take them more seriously, which leads to some strange outcomes. I mean, I think it's a bit odd to have Bath listed in the top 10 here. That would be my perspective. But by and large, I mean, you don't get so many surprises, of course, when you look at these. So by all means, do look at them. But I would say, take them with a grain of salt. And I think it would be somewhat rash to make your final decision between two departments based on which one was higher on some table. That probably wouldn't be the best index. Okay, so looking at Bristol's department then, we are really good at research. We're a relatively small, medium-sized department. We have this middle-age profile, which is good according to Roland Baddeley's theory, and neither favoured nor penalised in our position relative to other departments within the university. So, on those criteria, I think Bristol does quite well. But there's something else that's really important for you to consider, and that is where you're going to be for the next 3 years. This is a really important part of your life that's coming up. For most of you, the first time you leave home, there are a lot of firsts associated with this time in your life. And it's nice if you can be living somewhere where there are lots of interesting things going on, because you want to do well in your studies, you want to spend time on your degree, but also you want to do other things as well. And so it's good if there are lots of cultural opportunities, lots of interesting things happening. And Bristol certainly does well on that criterion. Bristol's just a wonderful place to live. So last year, the Sunday Times said, best city to live in the UK. Now, I've already been a little bit sceptical about league tables, so maybe you should take that with a grain of salt as well. But certainly, Bristol's a nice place to live. I mean, the thing that I'm most conscious of when I think about this is when I talk to students, how keen they are to stay in Bristol once they finish their degree. I was talking to a student of mine just yesterday, one of my third-year students, and I was asking her what she's doing after she graduates, and she looked at slightly downcast. She said, "Well, I've got this mental health care position," and I said, "Well, that's great, because that's what you want to do, right? You want to go on and follow this route of becoming a clinical psychologist, so that sounds perfect, great achievement." And she said, "Yes, that's true, but it's in Kent, so I'll have to leave Bristol." And I spoke to another student the same day who has some internship at a consulting company, and she was very pleased about that. That's just what she wants to do. But in some ways, she was even more pleased about the fact that it's in Bristol and she gets to stay here. So, talk to our students, talk to people here. Bristol's just a very nice part of the world that people want to try and stay in if they can. One of the nice things about the university's place within the city is that we occupy this somewhat unusual position of being what's called a precinct university. So we don't have a delineated campus that is separate from the city, nor are we one of these city universities where different departments can be spread all around the city. So there is a clear precinct. As you can see here, I mean, we occupy a particular geographical region of the city, but it's not a campus. There are plenty of other non-university buildings within this, and as you can see, we are right in the heart of town. You just have to go down the street a little bit and you get to Clifton Triangle, Park Street, Harbour, a really nice part of Bristol where you have all of your shops, your restaurants and your bars and coffee shops and so on. And that's one of the things that I really value about working here, the fact that we're not separated from the city, but actually right at the heart of it. Okay, so I feel like I don't have to sell Bristol too much because it's just self-evident what a vibrant, interesting place it is. It's not the only place, of course, so I'm sure somewhere like Brighton, York, I don't know anything about Birmingham really, so Roland says possibly surprisingly Birmingham, okay. But clearly there are other good places to live, but I think on this criterion Bristol does very well, and frankly there are some places where I think they have good psychology departments, but I'm not sure if it's where I'd want to spend 3 years, although I won't name those places. And then there's the university to think about. So again, you might think, well, why should I care about the university? Because after all, I'm just here to study psychology. And there are a couple of reasons. One is the student body is relevant to you, and the other is that it does have an impact on your job prospects subsequently. So, what can we say about Bristol students? Well, we're very fortunate. We get fantastic students at Bristol. I mean, one of the remarkable things that we find about our student cohort is that it's not just that we have some really bright students, everywhere has some really bright students, but we just don't seem to have any really poor students. So that's important because when you're teaching, it's often the case that you have to some extent, teach to the tail. That is, it's not much good if you have lectures where the course content is going over people's heads, where there are some people who are just not getting it. You have to kind of slide down the scale to make sure that everyone's on board. And we're fortunate at Bristol that we just don't seem to have that tail. So we can teach at a high level and have really motivated, engaged, clever students. And from your perspective as a student, the good thing about that is that you benefit from being with these other clever students in seminars and tutorials in this small group teaching. And then this does make a difference to your job prospects. Maybe it shouldn't, but it does. So, I mean, people know that Bristol is a good university. For many employers, even if they don't know a lot about different universities, they might have in their mind this idea that you've got Oxford and Cambridge top tier, and then when they think about other places, somewhere like Bristol is the kind of place that will be at the forefront of their mind as good universities. And the thing is, whether it's fair or not, and well, it's not fair, employers will tend to use that as a kind of a proxy for the quality of an individual. They'll look at the university they went to, which is, unfortunate. There'll be really great students from places like, Edge Hill, Roehampton, or wherever, who are, terrific students who would do really well if they were here, but employers will look at that and say, oh, well, they can't be as good as the person from Bristol. So again, I hope that won't be your sole consideration, but in the world we live in, that is something to consider. Okay. And then finally, let me say something about our course. I addressed this briefly this morning, saying, well, why is our course called Experimental Psychology? Why not just Psychology? And I mean, the shorter answer is it doesn't really matter. The degree that you get from Bristol is a degree in psychology, not in experimental psychology. Another short answer might be snobbery. There are different types of psychology. So many of you, when perhaps not our prospective students, but your parents, when you think of psychology, you might have in your mind some of these ideas about psychoanalysis, about focus groups, doing qualitative psychology, things which are a little bit touchy-feely perhaps. That's not the kind of psychology that we do here. And we're not unique in that respect. I mean, that's not the kind of psychology that you'll get at any Russell Group Department of Psychology. But I guess when people were thinking about what the name of this department should be, way back when, they really wanted to make that point clear by saying we are the Department of Experimental Psychology. And I think at the time, well, it's still the case that at Oxford, their psychology department is called the School of Experimental Psychology, so there was probably an aspect of emulation there as well. It doesn't actually make any difference to the psychology that you get taught, but it does, I guess, reflect a kind of a bias that we have towards a scientific approach to psychology. Now, one upshot of that is that if the kind of psychology that you're interested in is something more psychoanalytic or qualitative or possibly something like forensic, that's not the kind of psychology that you're going to get here. Now, if you want to be a forensic psychologist, what you have to do is get a good undergraduate degree in psychology and then go on and specialize. So we will certainly have some students who do that. But if what you really want is to be getting a lot of, let's say, forensic psychology during your undergraduate degree, then that's not something you're going to get here. It's important that you know a little bit about the flavor of psychology that's taught at different departments so that you don't end up at somewhere that's the wrong place for you. Okay, I mean, as I said, there are a lot of similarity across different departments in first and second year. It really is third year that's more distinctive. Something that is good for you to do, if you want to try to get a better feel for these differences across departments, have a look at who it is that would be teaching the course and what kind of research they do, because that will give you a good kind of idea of the flavor of psychology that's taught at those universities. What you can see here is that we're pretty broad in our research interests. I mentioned that I do a lot of research on language, and there are quite a few of us who do that. But then there are also people who specialize in neuropsychology, in how we perceive the world, in social psychology, developmental we're strong in, and quite a big group now who do work on various aspects of health psychology. So the nature of addiction to tobacco and alcohol, eating disorders, and so on. Accommodation, that's of course something that you want to consider. Hopefully you all had a chance to go on these accommodation tours that we had this morning. So some of you will have gone on the coach to Stoke Bishop. Others will have gone on the walking tour. I know it's somewhat limited what you get from those tours because we are within the academic year, and so the places where you're visiting are places where there are students currently living, and that makes it a bit harder to get the kind of access you might like. Some of you perhaps will have already seen the accommodation during one of our open days. I do encourage you to have a look at the web pages. So if you go to University of Bristol website, have a look at accommodation there, you can see lots of virtual tours, and also talk to our current students about their experiences of accommodation in Bristol. One thing that we can say about Bristol accommodation is that after first year, so when you move out of halls, you'll have to find somewhere to live, and Bristol is somewhat more expensive than some of the other places that you might be considering. It's cheaper than London, quite a bit cheaper than London, but more expensive than some of the places, for instance, in the north of the country. That's because all of these university buildings are in a really nice part of Bristol. Each of those little red balloons are places where we have our city halls. So very nice parts of Bristol. It costs a lot to live in those places. You get places like this, Goldney Hall in Clifton, where they filmed Sherlock Holmes. Some quite spectacular locations, actually. After you move out of halls, then you'll have to find somewhere like Cottam or Redland or Clifton. Very nice parts of Bristol, but not cheap. So that's a consideration. So should Emily, or in my case Hope, come to Bristol? Well, I would say yes, it's a good idea. Lots of good things about Bristol. The reason that I hesitate is that, her dad works there, so probably she wouldn't want to come. But what you will get at Bristol is a place where we really value scientific psychology. We're really enthusiastic about doing science. We want to impart that enthusiasm for scientific research to our students. And you'll be at a really good university. So, there are other places you can consider. These are all good places. So, as I said at the outset, I don't want to try and give you the hard sell, say you must come to Bristol. Plenty of good places you can go. And my colleagues, if you come over and talk to us in the Psychology Hub, will, I'm sure, be only too happy to tell you about their own experiences about other places, not just Bristol, but these other institutions. One of the things that psychologists are particularly interested in is decision making. How do we go about making complex decisions? How should we go about doing it? For any decision, in principle, there is a rational way to approach it. An optimal approach where you consider all of the variables, you assign weights to each of these different factors, and then you come up with the right solution. Well, of course, in practice, it's very difficult to do that. It turns out, from psychological research, that often, faced with complex decisions where there's a lot of uncertainty, then you do just as well, or better, if you just sleep on it and then go with your gut feeling. You make use of these heuristics, which are often applied unconsciously. So, if you do your research as you're doing, you visit lots of places, and then you're still not quite sure, you end up going with your gut feeling, well, you won't go too far wrong. But selfishly, I hope that if you are keen about psychology, you're particularly interested in a scientific approach to psychology, that you will consider Bristol. Wherever you go, good luck, and I hope you make the right decision for you and that you enjoy studying psychology. So, thank you very much.